Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Ransom Church. It is so good to have you here. My name is Phil Wiseman, and I am the downtown campus pastor. Pastor Phil Tagg, our lead pastor, is on a missions trip to the Dominican Republic, so we can be praying for them. And Cody Toops is with them, our South Campus pastor, so just be lifting them up in prayers as we've got a team down there. I'm sure that they're sweating quite a bit. I bet you if it's warm here, I bet you it's warm there too. So, but we're thankful that they get to go serve. And I have the privilege of preaching today. We're continuing our series on Acts, the book of Acts. It's called Sent. Now, the book of Acts is a story of how the church began. And we're a church, so naturally, this is a great book for us to study. And hopefully you're tracking with us in our reading challenge. We actually have been inviting you to read along the book of Acts with us, a chapter a day, and journey through that book together as a church, as we try to discern what has God called us to in the world? What's he called us to be? And that's the point of this series, and that's the thing that we're asking God to reveal. Now, as we get started today, I want to ask you a question. What is the bravest thing that you have ever done? What is the bravest thing that you have ever done? I want you to take a few moments and just kind of quietly reflect on that, think to yourself for a minute, and as you do that, watch this video. Okay, did you figure it out? What's the bravest thing you've ever done? I'll tell you one thing. I haven't done any of the things you just saw in that video, especially jumping off a mountain with a flying squirrel suit and threading the needle between little holes in mountains. Never done that and probably never will. But the question for us is, what exactly is bravery? What exactly is bravery? I mean, I think there's probably several answers to that question, but I think there's a kind of bravery that it actually it's where somebody is kind of focused on what they get out of it. So like maybe you might be willing to put yourself at significant risk, but you know there's a big payout in the end for you. You know, maybe you'll get a lot of money, maybe you'll get a lot of glory, maybe you'll get a lot of likes on your YouTube page, maybe it's just the thrill of having done it, I don't know. There's a kind of bravery that really kind of circles back to yourself. But there's another kind of bravery that's fueled not by personal gain, but rather by a deep conviction about what's wrong and what's right. This kind of bravery is actually willing to sacrifice one's own safety and reputation for the sake of something greater than themselves. It's where the ideal becomes so important that it's more important than your own well-being or safety. Maybe you've met somebody before like this. There's a level of commitment in them, and it leads to sort of this just like a centeredness to who they are, where when things go wrong or there's setbacks or there's threats or persecution, they're not swayed by the thoughts of others. It's like there's this compass that is set toward what is right and what is good, and nothing can take them off of course. On January 2nd, 2007, a man named Wesley Autry was waiting for a train with his two daughters. And soon, he noticed there was another man there having a seizure. So he leapt into action. He borrowed a pen from somebody else, and he used the pen to keep the man's mouth open as he had the seizure so he wouldn't suffocate. And soon the seizure ended, but the story was far from over. You see, no sooner had it ended than Wesley looked over again and saw the man had stumbled onto the train tracks, and he looked up and saw the light of a train coming towards them. Now pause for a second and ask yourself, what would you do here? I mean, you only have seconds to act. You don't have time to make a pro-cons list here. Your daughters are watching you, which means that things could go heroically well or tragically bad. Your behavior in this situation, though, I believe, will not be determined in that moment. It will not be determined in that moment. Rather, it will have been made a long time ago. It will be determined by the ideals that you've committed to and every small decision that you have made along the way. You see, bravery is not chosen in a moment. It is formed over a lifetime of choices. Your behavior in that moment is formed over a lifetime of choices. Wesley Autry leapt onto the tracks. He attempted to drag this man to safety, but soon realized that he did not have time to get this man to safety before the train would be upon them, and so he improvised. He threw the man in a drainage ditch between the tracks, threw himself on top of him, and gave him a big bear hug as the train came screaming over both of them. The conductor of the train applied the brakes, but of course you can't stop a train on a dime, which meant that the whole train, except for 2 cars, came over them both. They both emerged unharmed, except there was grease stains on the back of Wesley Autry's cap because it was that close to the bottom of the train. Now, I believe that moment between the tracks is not chosen at the time. Rather, it's something that is forged in a person's character long before they ever get there. That moment between the tracks, it's not about what you're going to get out of it. When it's just you between a train and somebody else's life, you're not thinking, man, I wonder if my video is going to go viral. You're thinking, Lord, help. And then you throw yourself down because in that moment you know there's something bigger than yourself that you're committed to. Bravery happens when you find something that is more compelling than your own life or comfort. Bravery happens when you find something that is more compelling than your own life or comfort. And so the question for us is, well, how is a brave person made? What makes bravery in a person? Because as followers of Jesus, I think we're going to face a between-the-tracks sort of situation where you have to ask yourself, am I going to obey humans or am I going to obey God? And sometimes obeying God might cost you. Sometimes it happens in public, sometimes it happens in your heart, but nonetheless, as followers of Jesus, we have these decisions to make, perhaps every day. In Acts chapter 4, we see one such moment. I would love for you to join me. Acts chapter 4, verses 1 through 7 is where we'll begin. If you don't have a Bible, put your hand up, and the ushers will bring one to you. And if you don't own a Bible, you can keep this one. We'll be on page 656 of our church Bibles. Page 656, if you're using one of the church Bibles. Just put your hand up, and the ushers will bring you one. Peter and John had just healed a man. In fact, that's in chapter 3, and Phil Tagg's going to preach on that next week, but like I said, he's gone, so we're kind of reversing the order here. But we'll catch up next week. But they healed a man, and as a result, the disciples are getting a lot of attention. That's where we're going to pick it up right here. It says, while Peter and John were speaking to the people, they were confronted by the priests, the captain of the temple guard, and some of the Sadducees. These leaders were very disturbed that Peter and John were teaching the people that through Jesus there is a resurrection of the dead. They arrested them and, since it was already evening, put them in jail until morning. But many of the people who heard their message believed it, so the number of men who believed now totaled about 5,000. The next day, the council of all the rulers and elders and teachers of religious law met in Jerusalem. Annas the high priest was there, along with Caiaphas, John, Alexander, and other relatives of the high priest. They brought in the 2 disciples and demanded, by what power or in whose name have you done this? So clearly the disciples are getting a lot of attention here, aren't they? The religious authorities are noticing them, and it says that 5,000 men had come to believe in Jesus as a result of their ministry. And keep in mind, when you add women and children to that number, it's a lot bigger than that. And so this is a large number of people in Jerusalem that are all of a sudden following Jesus. It's no wonder the religious authorities were taking notice. Now, the men in power did not like what they saw when they saw what Peter and John were doing, and simply because they were preaching the gospel, the news that Jesus had come back from the dead, simply because they were preaching the gospel, Peter and John were arrested. And the next day, they were brought into the temple courts, placed in front of a rather intimidating group of men, and all of them were powerful, and all of them were interested in keeping that power. Now, let me give you a little background of these guys. The passage calls these people the priests, the captain of the temple guard, and the Sadducees. So these are the ones who ruled the Jewish people. They were in charge of the temple system. They were in charge of settling legal disputes for the Jews. So they're very powerful, and it's important to notice that the text wants us to see that they were heavily influenced by the Sadducees. Now, let's talk about what Sadducees are. In first century Judaism, which is what Peter and John would have been, they were Jews, it was the first century, there was a lot of different groups. Kind of like today, we have different denominations in churches. There's different groups in first century Judaism. The Sadducees were one of them. Maybe you've heard of the Pharisees. We've talked about the Pharisees before too. Now, the Pharisees were a little different than the Sadducees. The Pharisees, they were waiting for the Messiah to come. The Messiah was the word they gave to the person who they believed God was going to send to deliver them from oppression. They were waiting for a mighty leader to come along and to lead them in a militaristic campaign into freedom. And the Pharisees were thinking to themselves, well, if we follow the law really, really well, maybe that'll kind of hurry God along in sending the Messiah. And so they would follow the law really well. In fact, they would build extra laws around the law to make sure they didn't break any of the actual laws. So that was the Pharisees. The Sadducees were a little different, though. You see, the Sadducees, they already believed that the Messianic age had come. They believed that God had already sent the Messiah. In fact, a couple hundred years earlier, there was a Jewish family named the Hasmoneans. And the Hasmoneans led a very successful rebellion and established a fair amount of peace and prosperity for the Jewish people for a period of time. And so back then when this happened, everyone was kind of going, oh, hey, maybe this is it. Maybe God has answered our prayers. Maybe he has sent his Messiah, and it's in this family, the Hasmoneans. And so the Sadducees were set up at the time to kind of protect and oversee this Messianic age, this new age of freedom. And so already you can see how Peter and John's message that Jesus was the true Messiah would have made them feel a little threatened. Anytime you make people with power feel threatened, things usually don't go well for you. And so they asked them this question. They put this to Peter and John. They say, by what power or in whose name have you done this? So this is the sort of moment where you got to decide if you're going to save your own skin or not. And nobody would blame you for tweaking your answer just a little bit to save your life. Like when you're standing in front of these guys and you know that they're not going to tolerate anybody getting out of line, nobody would blame you for, just being a little bit ambiguous with your answer. Nobody would blame you for being a little bit general in the way that you answered the question. The truth is I'm really good at finding reasons to keep Jesus out of my conversations. I always say to myself, well, I don't want to scare him off yet, I don't want to offend them. I'm just sowing seeds, I always say that. I'm just sowing seeds. And I think that's legitimate. Like we sow seeds and maybe later on God waters the seeds right? But it seems like that's all I'm ever doing. How come I never can bring Jesus up into my conversations? That's why I love Peter's response. He says, then Peter, filled with the Holy Spirit, said to them, rulers and elders of our people, are we being questioned today because we've done a good deed for a crippled man? Do you want to know how he was healed? Let me clearly state to all of you and to all the people of Israel that he was healed by the powerful name of Jesus Christ the Nazarene, the man you crucified, but whom God raised from the dead. For Jesus is the one referred to in the scriptures where it says, the stone that you builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. There is salvation in no one else. God has given no other name under heaven by which we must be saved. You see, Peter is not fazed by their question one bit, is he? It's kind of like he's saying, oh, you want to know whose name I healed that man in? Okay, let me be really clear. Because I got 5,000 people over here who seem to have gotten it, but maybe I stuttered because you seem confused. So let me lay it out straight for you. His name is Jesus. You killed him, and God brought him back to life. And I can imagine there might have been a mic drop after that or something. He just lays it out there for them. He doesn't hesitate at all. He throws himself between the tracks, And he says, no matter what happens, I have to proclaim the truth. Why? Because he had found something more compelling than his own life or comfort. And so without a moment's hesitation, he looks them in the eye and he tells them the truth about Jesus. Now it's interesting that Luke, who's the author of Acts, he included the names of the Sadducees and the high priests. Did you notice that? It's in verse 6. It says, Annas, the high priest, was there, along with Caiaphas, John, Alexander, and other relatives of the high priest. Now, that might seem random at first, but actually they're very important, especially Annas and Caiaphas. You see, just a few weeks earlier, Peter had been in the presence of these guys under very different circumstances. We read about it in John 18:12-17. It says, so the soldiers, their commanding officer, and the temple guards arrested Jesus and tied him up. First, they took him to Annas, since he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest at the time. Caiaphas was the one who had told the other Jewish leaders, it's better that one man should die for the people. Simon Peter followed Jesus, as did another of the disciples. That other disciple was acquainted with the high priest, so he was allowed to enter the high priest's courtyard with Jesus. Peter had to stay outside the gate. Then the disciple who knew the high priest spoke to the woman watching the gate, and she let Peter in. The woman asked Peter, you're not one of that man's disciples, are you? No, he said, I am not. You see, only a few weeks earlier, not much time has passed. Just a few weeks earlier, Peter stood in the presence of those same men, Annas and Caiaphas, maybe even in the same courtyard, and denied that he was a disciple of Jesus. Fast forward to Acts chapter 4, and it's like a full circle kind of moment. There he is, looking at Caiaphas, looking at Annas in a courtyard. But it's a whole new Peter. So what changed? How did Peter go from trying to save his own skin to dropping mics? I think the answer is actually pretty simple, and it's this, that Peter, he had a personal encounter with the resurrected Jesus. Peter had a personal encounter with the resurrected Jesus. It's really not that complicated. I mean, if a guy is claiming to be the Messiah, and then you see him die, but then you see him again a few days later and he's alive, you should probably go with that guy, right? I mean, it's not rocket science. He had a personal encounter with the resurrected Jesus. And that changed everything for Peter. You see, boldness in your faith comes from having a personal encounter with Jesus Christ. Boldness in your faith comes from having a personal encounter with Jesus Christ. And it seems straightforward, but we miss it so often. Listen, we have more strategies in the church today than we've ever had. We've got more devotional books, more radio stations, bigger budgets, and better sound system than we've ever had in history. But sometimes I wonder if we're missing the most important thing. In all of it, can we miss the real presence of Jesus sometimes? Verse 13 says, the members of the council were amazed when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, for they could see that they were ordinary men with no special training in the scriptures. They also recognized them as men who had been with Jesus. They were ordinary men, but they had been with Jesus. You see, ordinary plus Jesus equals extraordinary. When we are people who have been with Jesus, we will be changed. That's just a fact. And so if you're a Christian here today, I want to ask you a question. When was the last time that you came face to face with God? When was the last time that you walked out of a room and you were like, I just met with God in there? When was the last time that you had this undeniable, unforgettable experience with the living God? Has it ever happened? Have you ever had that happen to you? As we were preparing to launch our South Campus, we're a church with 2 campuses. And as we were preparing to launch our South Campus, we asked ourselves a question over and over again. And the question was this: what is the Ransom DNA? In other words, what makes the Ransom the Ransom? What makes us who we are? Because we want anyone who comes into either campus to come into the Ransom. We want this to be the same experience no matter where you are. And so we spend a lot of time kind of asking the question. So our DNA is all about how we operate. We have the same colors, the same decorations, the same corrugated metal on the sound booths, the same polished concrete floors at both campuses, the same chairs, same systems and processes. Everything's the same so that when you come into either campus, you get the same experience. But my hope and my prayer, and I know it's the hope and prayer of everyone else too, it's that we can get to a place where the thing that defines the Ransom, even more than cool graphics or concrete floors, even more than powerful messages, is that it would be a place where people encounter Jesus, the real presence of the resurrected Christ in our midst. That God would make us into a church that when someone describes who we are, and I've heard people describe us, and it's not bad things. It's like people talk about how we're real or we're authentic or we're caring. One thing I hear a lot of people say is, oh, the Ransom, that's the church that serves. And it's true, we do. But the thing that I hope that people would describe us as is this. I hope that they would say, the Ransom Church, that's a place where God shows up. That's a place where God shows up. Sometimes it's a little weird even. That's a place where God shows up. Peter denied Christ 3 times, and then a few days later he saw him again after having seen him die. Jesus didn't say at that moment, he didn't say, hey, Pete, you really screwed that up back there, didn't you? That's not what he did. He didn't rub his face in it. What did he do? He reinstates him. He tells him to watch over his church. He gives him a job. But listen to what Jesus says to Peter after that moment. He says this. He says, I tell you the truth, when you were young, you were able to do as you liked. You dressed yourself and went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and others will dress you and take you where you don't want to go. Jesus said this to let him know by what kind of death he would glorify God. Then Jesus told him, follow me. You see, according to church tradition, Peter would one day be led to a place he didn't want to go. Old and blind, he would stretch out his arms as well as they nailed him to a cross for his faith. But according to tradition, Peter begged his executioners to crucify him upside down because he was not worthy to die in the same manner as his Lord. Peter denied even knowing Jesus at one point, But when you encounter the resurrected Jesus, something changes. Back in Acts 4, verse 16 says, what should we do with these men? They asked each other. We can't deny that they have performed a miraculous sign and everybody in Jerusalem knows about it. But to keep them from spreading their propaganda any further, we must warn them not to speak to anyone in Jesus' name again. So they called the disciples back in and commanded them never to speak or to teach in the name of Jesus. You can about guess how that's going to go, right? But Peter and John replied, do you think God wants us to obey you rather than him? We cannot stop telling about everything we have seen and heard. So Ransom Church, do you want to be brave? Do you want to throw yourself between the tracks? Do you want to obey God rather than humans? For the sake of Jesus? For the sake of our communities? For the sake of the world? Are you ready to be a church that is sent on a mission by God? Because remember, your decision between the tracks will not be decided in that moment. It is based on the kind of person that you've become. And so if you want to know that you will live with boldness then you must walk in the presence of Jesus now. If you want to know that you will live with boldness then in your faith, then you must walk in the presence of Jesus now. The story of the Ransom Church is actually pretty remarkable. We started about 8 years ago. We've grown a lot. We've got 2 campuses. Seen God do lots of crazy cool things. I'm privileged to have been a part of it from the very beginning. My wife Natalie and I, we were here from the start, and it's been incredible. But my heart lately is starting to be convicted a little bit. God has been saying to me, Phil, have you grown comfortable? Have you grown comfortable? And I started to realize that, I've ministered here for years. I've been here for years, but over time, responsibility increases. The church grows, and you got more demands on your time and that sort of thing, and I've stopped going into the community as much as I used to. I started expecting the community to come to me. That's not boldness, that's comfort. That's laziness. There's a scene in The Dark Knight Rises, Batman movie, where Bane says to Batman, he's like, "Victory has defeated you, Batman." You know what I'm talking about? It's like one of those moments. It's like, have I grown too comfortable that I'm not even willing to go out into the community anymore? Pastor Phil and I, we used to volunteer every Thursday afternoon somewhere in the community. But then you get busy. You got more demands. And you stop doing those things. And so I've started doing prayer walks in the neighborhood around the downtown campus, and my simple prayer has been this. It's been, God, show me what you're doing here. God, you're already here. You're already moving. Show me what you're doing here. And God, would you bring somebody along that I can have a faith conversation with? And wouldn't you know, just about every time, it's happened. So let's be a church that expects God to show up in our midst. Last week at the downtown campus, Pastor Phil Tagg invited people to come pray at the altar after his message was over, and it got real crowded up here, some services. And I was just standing there watching, and I was thinking, God, thank you. Thank you for moving. Thank you for being a God that never stops. Thank you for us being a church that's willing to hear your voice and respond to it. But then I was thinking, man, I want that to be normal. I want that to be normal. Because if we're going to live with boldness then we got to walk with Jesus now. And bravery comes by having a personal encounter with the resurrected Christ. So I want it to be normal. Because when that happens, when you encounter God like that, you can't just keep it in. We'll be like Peter and John, who said, we cannot stop telling about everything we have seen and heard. So let's be a church that comes with the expectation that we will meet the risen Lord when we come together. And let's let that spill over into our weeks and into our communities, into our lives. Let's throw ourselves between the tracks for the sake of the gospel. We're going to close with a word of prayer at our separate campuses now. So here at the downtown campus, you'll notice in your handout, it'll be on the screen as well, but there's a prayer in there. And I'd love for us to read it out loud together. Now, this prayer was written by John Wesley. We're a Wesleyan church. You may not realize that. We're part of a denomination called the Wesleyan Church. We trace our roots back, of course, to Jesus. But in the 1700s in England, there was a man named John Wesley who had a big impact for the Lord. And we kind of trace our heritage to him as well. And he wrote this prayer. It's called Wesley's Prayer of Surrender. We're going to read it together out loud. And I want us to do it deliberately. I want us to do it slowly and carefully. I want us not to rush through this or past it. I want us to internalize everything that we're saying. And I just want to warn you too, I might pause every now and then just to reflect on something we just read, so don't get ahead of me. But let God speak to you through this as well. Here we go. It says, I am no longer my own, but yours. Put me to what you will. Place me with whom you will. Put me to doing. Put me to suffering. Hold on a second. You see what you just prayed? It's like I just punked you. I tricked you into saying, God, put me to suffering. Are you willing to do whatever it takes? Am I willing to put myself between the tracks for God, for his glory and for his gospel? Even if it means suffering, because we can get behind things. I can get behind planning a church if I really think it's going to grow. If I think things are going to go well. Sure, I'll do it, God. But what if he calls me to suffer on behalf of him? Then I'm not so sure. Put me to doing, put me to suffering. Let's keep going. Let me be put to work for you or set aside for you. Now, just a second. I like to be in the middle of the action. If God's doing something, that's cool. I just want to know I'm a part of it. What if God says to me, hey, Phil, just hold on to your horses for a second. I'm doing something. Am I willing to be vulnerable before God? Am I willing to do whatever it is that he calls of me? Let's keep going. Praised for you or criticized for you. Let me be full. Let me be empty. Let me have all things. Let me have nothing. I freely and fully surrender all things to your glory and service. And now, O wonderful and holy God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer, you are mine and I am yours. So be it. And the covenant which I have made on earth, let it also be made in heaven. Amen. If you prayed that prayer and you meant it today, I would say get ready. Because God likes to honor these sorts of prayers. These are the kinds of prayers that God likes to answer. And so if that was you today, and I hope it was, let's give ourselves fully over to him and be a church that encounters the resurrected Christ.